So we sang the words of the Psalms today, how very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. You could also say how very sad and unpleasant it is when people don't live in unity. It seems that our culture, our nation, our world is so deeply divided. Where is the call for unity? Where is a sense of our shared humanity? There are many reasons why we aren't united, but perhaps the two most powerful should not be unfamiliar to us as Christians. Number one, Penny preached on just a few weeks ago. We are slow to offer forgiveness to others. What I want to talk about is the second reason. We are also slow to receive forgiveness. As Christians, nothing should be more at the front and center of our faith than forgiveness. Jesus teaches forgiveness over and over again. A third of his parables are about forgiveness. 2/3 of his teaching is on forgiveness. He understands the cost when we don't forgive and when we don't receive forgiveness. It's a physical cost for sure. I think we'll learn more and more about this as science gets a little bit better at finding the causes of things. But it's an emotional cost. I think we can all attest to it's a spiritual cost as well. Jesus does not want us to be the prodigal son who refuses the Father's embrace. Jesus doesn't want us to be the lost sheep who will not let herself be picked up and carried through a difficult time. I think we can understand the cost of a heart, for example, that says, you know what? I'm only going to pump out blood from now on. I'm not going to take any in. Or imagine a lung that says, you know what? I'm just going to give off carbon dioxide. I'm going to stop taking in oxygen. We know that that wouldn't last for very long. And yet, don't we understand that a soul that is not willing to receive grace is unable to really, in any sustained, transformative way, offer grace to others? It's no different. The human soul is like the heart and the lungs. It's a flow that we must participate in. There's a cost when we try to extend grace and we don't know anything about it ourselves. Last week we were introduced to the family of Jacob, and we learned about Jacob's 3 wives. We learned that Rachel was his favorite wife, and we learned that the 2 children, the 2 sons that he had with Rachel were his favorite sons, Joseph and Benjamin, but we know that Joseph was his favored one. Joseph was the one that got that fancy multicolored robe, the one that a king gives to a prince, and he was feeling pretty self-important. Something that rubbed his brothers the wrong way. And they didn't like Joseph. In fact, they hated him. And they plotted to kill him. And one day, they brought him out and said, "Come on, Joseph, join us. We're going to go herd some sheep." And their plan was to dig a pit and put Joseph in it and let him die. But they decided, well, why don't we make a little money on this? So they decided to sell Joseph to some Egyptian slave traders. And then they took some goat's blood and they poured it over that fancy coat, and they brought it back to Dad and said, "We are so sorry. Joseph was killed by wild animals." When Joseph arrived in Egypt, he was sold as a slave to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's guards, actually the captain of the guards. And Potiphar learned very quickly Joseph was a talented man. He was a great administrator, and Potiphar over time turned more and more of his affairs over to Joseph, and Joseph was succeeding at all of them. In fact, nothing seemed to stop Joseph's star from rising except Potiphar's wife, who thought he was a pretty good-looking guy and tried to seduce him. But being a good, upstanding man, he refused her overtures, and she was not happy about it, so she made it look like he was trying to seduce her, which got him thrown into prison. Now, Joseph had always been an avid dreamer and had some really revelatory dreams, some of which he shared with his brothers, and not a very wise decision, which led them to hate him even more. But word got out to the prisoners, the fellow prisoners, that he was good at interpreting dreams. So people started to share with him their dreams. Well, wouldn't you know, Pharaoh had a couple dreams he didn't know what to make sense of. Word got back to Pharaoh that Joseph might help you interpret your dreams. And so Pharaoh went to Joseph and he told him about a dream that he had of 7 skinny cows that had eaten up 7 fat cows, and 7 ears of corn that were really thin ate up 7 fat ears. And when Joseph said, I think you're going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, Pharaoh said, I'm going to put you in charge of food and grain management for the next 14 years. And so he did. And so Joseph made sure in those 7 years of plenty that enough grain was stored away so that they could overcome the great famine and had enough food for themselves, for their nation. Well, it was a great famine. Those 7 years of plenty happened. The 7 years of famine happened next. And not only did that famine affect Egypt, it affected all of the surrounding communities, including the land of Canaan, where Jacob's family still lived. Well, Jacob, being a wise father, decided, well, I heard there's some grain in Egypt, so I'm going to send my sons, I'm going to keep Benjamin home because he's my new favorite one. But maybe you brothers, 10 of you, can go and bring us some food. And so they went. And when they arrived in Egypt, they were face to face with their brother, but they didn't recognize him. And Joseph wanted to determine whether Benjamin was alive, whether the father was alive. And when he determined that that was the case, he sent the rest of them back. He kept one as a hostage. And he asked them, if you want more grain, you must return with your brother Benjamin. So the 10 half-brothers went back to Israel and told their father everything. But still, the old man refused to send Benjamin to get more grain. And then finally, the famine got so great that he relented. And he sent Benjamin. He was so afraid that he was going to lose his only other son that he truly loved. Well, he sent Benjamin. And when Joseph saw Benjamin, he was incredibly emotional, but he tried to cover it up. And then he sent the brothers back with some grain. But this time he asked the steward to put this silver cup in Benjamin's grain sack to make it look like Benjamin had stolen it. And so when the brothers set out a ways, the steward went and got them and caught Benjamin in the act of stealing. And on their way back, they were horrified and they started to feel guilty. And they started to think, maybe this is God punishing us today for what we did so many years ago. And when they came into the presence of Joseph, not realizing that Joseph understood every word they were saying, they began to express the guilt for having done something so horrible to their brother. And that's where we found ourselves in the text for today, when Joseph can't stand the charade anymore, and he sends out the Egyptians, and he's face to face with his brothers. He reveals his identity, and they are overwhelmed with emotion. He cries so loudly that the Egyptians hear him. And then he sends off the entire brothers to go back to Israel and bring the rest of the family, all 70 of them, to Egypt, sending them off with treasures and gifts of all kinds, including food. And in Egypt, Joseph would care for his family for all the years to come. As Pastor Bruce pointed out, this is a family with many flaws, and we reflected on those flaws, but the one thing they seem to understand really deeply is the power of forgiveness. Years ago, if you remember, Jacob received forgiveness from his brother Esau, and it changed the direction of his life. And today, it's Jacob's family that is a recipient of forgiveness, and their lives and their children's lives are forever changed because of that act that Joseph offers them. Now, you would understand it if Joseph's heart was too hard to do this. After all, he had been betrayed. He had been left for dead. But instead, he chooses this path of forgiveness and goes far and beyond what anyone would expect of him, lavishing them changing their lives for the better. Can you imagine what it was like for Joseph's brothers to be forgiven? Have you had a moment in your life, maybe a series of them, when you expected condemnation or judgment? You felt like you deserved it, and you probably did. But instead of judgment and condemnation, you received kindness and mercy. I remember when I was in college, I did a series of stupid things, but one really bad thing. And I had to face the police officer who was the person who got the blunt of my bad decisions. Here I was face to face with this man in blue. I expected judgment, condemnation, and I would have understood it. But what I received was kindness and a heartfelt appeal to me from him to change my life for the better. The more distance I get from that experience, the more I thank God for it. Not only for the act of that police officer, but for my mistake. Without that mistake, I don't think grace would have entered into my heart and life the way that it did that day. Something awakened in me. God accessed me in a way that I don't think was possible any other way than me making a complete mistake and failure in my life. Maybe you can think about a time in your life when you experienced the power of grace. There was so much shame in that experience for me, but what cut through it all was kindness and mercy. And it awakened in something in me, the way that punishment just doesn't have the power to do. You would think as Christians this would be our story, all of our stories. You would think that we would receive grace so much easier than we do. This week at choir school, we learned about Martin Luther, about the great Reformation. Luther, who said that we are saved by grace through faith, not by some achievement of ours. We don't earn grace. It's given freely all the time through the grace of God. It was Luther who taught us that we are at the same time sinner and saint. So as sinners, why should it ever surprise us that we're in need of grace? Why should it ever surprise us that we fall short of our best self? We all need grace. We need it every day. Every time we gather for worship, what do? We confess our sins. Then we hear the words of assurance. Know that you are forgiven, we are told, and be at peace. And then we're challenged as forgiven and forgiving people to extend to one another the peace of Christ. You would think doing this week after week, year after year, we would be experts in grace. But has it really sunk in? How many of us as Presbyterians might say, well, grace is for those people. It's not for us, right? We don't really need grace. We're good people, right? But do we let ourselves feel the weight of sin? The weight of our sin, but the weight of the sin of our nation, our culture, our world. Do we really feel the weight of it? And do we really let grace do its tenderizing work on our hearts and our soul? Do we welcome mercy and grace's great assault on our pride and our ego? And isn't that what gets in our way? Isn't it our pride? Isn't it our ego? When we admit mistakes, when we ask for forgiveness, when we open ourselves to grace, it is an assault on our self-image. And so many of us spend so much energy trying to create this Instagram-worthy look out there, scrubbing ourselves, polishing ourselves so we look like a bright and shiny object of perfection in the world. But here's the deal. God doesn't fall for our Instagram account. God doesn't believe the hype. God sees right through it into our hearts. He sees the sin, but he also sees the saint. And that's what God is focused on. And God wants to help that saint come forth. That place in your life where you and God are just connected and one. That place where you are connected with your brothers and sisters. That's what God is at work doing. For God sees in you what you cannot see in yourself. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that you can't understand God until you understand forgiveness. I don't think we can understand until we've experienced grace. Maybe that's why Richard Rohr likes to say, after the age of 30, we stop learning from our success, and we only learn from failure. Boy, is that hard to hear. After 30, we learn only from our mistakes. You see, our failures are the only thing that break through the ego's grip on that self-identity that we pretend or we believe is who we are. Why else would Jesus be so insistent on forgiveness? Why would Jesus, in the parable of the unforgiving servant, I hope you take a look at it today, why would he be so angry with this servant? Not for what he did to receive grace, but for his unwillingness to offer the same gift that he had been given to other people who were in need of that same grace. You see, forgiveness isn't the one thing among many, it's the thing that Jesus wants us to understand, the deepest expression of God's love. So let me close with a favorite story that I think brings this together. In a remote village surrounded by lush green meadows and quiet valleys lived a young man named Luca. Luca had a reputation that cast a dark shadow over his name. He was known far and wide as a cunning sheep thief. Night after night, he would sneak into the pastures of the village and steal the finest sheep, leaving the shepherds and the villagers exasperated and outraged at what he had done. Despite his dubious activities, Luca was not entirely heartless. He grew up in poverty, and his thefts were an attempt, a desperate one, to provide for his family. However, his actions caused deep distress among the villagers who relied on these flocks for sustenance. And one fateful night, as Luca was attempting to make off with his latest haul, he was caught in the act by a group of irate shepherds. Tired of the sheep disappearing and eager to teach Luca a lesson, they apprehended him and brought him before the village council, which was a council comprised of wise elders who believed in second chances, as well as the transformative power of justice and mercy. So instead of casting Luca out and subjecting him to harsh punishment, they decided that Luca should be branded on his forehead the letters ST, signifying sheep thief. This was to serve as a permanent mark of his transgressions, a constant reminder every time he looked in the mirror and every time someone looked at him of his actions that had caused others pain. Embarrassed and ashamed, Luca made the decision to stay in the village, to face the consequences of his actions. And over time, he started to feel the weight of the ST on his forehead, not just as a punishment, but as a symbol of the person that he used to be and he didn't want to be any longer. He realized he wanted to change, not just for himself, but for the village. He began to tirelessly make amends with all those that he had hurt over the years. He helped shepherds mend their fences. He helped them care for the sheep, and he even thwarted potential thieves from the other villages. And slowly but surely, the villagers began to see that this transformation going on in Luca, and they admired him. They noticed how sincere he was and how resilient he was, and some even chose to forgive him for his past mistakes. Years passed, and as Luca continued his journey of transformation and redemption, he became known as the saint of the branded forehead. People from neighboring villages would seek his counsel, inspired by his story of transformation. His branded forehead, once a mark of shame, now symbolized the capacity for change and the potential for good in every human being, even the most flawed individuals. And in the end, it wasn't just Luca who changed, but the village changed as well. The branded letters, ST, sheep thief, saint, on his forehead had become a testament to the power of forgiveness and the ability of all people to be able to rise above their past. Amen.